forthwith, let's go straight into a question time. Who'd like to ask a question? There you are, you silenced them all. Ah, here's a question down here, Madame.
Question that possibly more than one person could answer, but I've put it against Sir Derek's name, which says, why did it take, or has it taken, the UK so long to sign up to the Hague Convention? That's the first part of the question. And the second one is a question about UNESCO. Shall I leave that till you've talked about the Hague Convention? Thank you. Sorry. The second bit of it was about UNESCO. You said about the US withdrawing from, and the UK now going to do the same. And all because Palestine had, I'm not sure I understood the bit about, you said because Palestine had become involved. Is that because UNESCO was actually recognizing Palestine as a state, and therefore the Americans withdrew? Was that the reason? So two questions.
Yes, please, Derek, yeah.
Well, on the second part of the question first, the United States withdrew its funding for UNESCO because it was obliged to, and the administration was obliged to by congressional legislation, when the members of UNESCO, the member states, the individual member states collectively voted for the admission of Palestine to UNESCO. It was a sort of, after a step was taken in the General Assembly, which recognized Palestine as just about a state, the next stage was going to be their joining international organizations. Nobody was quite sure which one they would apply to. They applied to UNESCO. The majority of countries in the world recognize Palestine as a state. Even some European countries are now moving in that direction or have already done so. So it's not surprising that there's a majority for it. It happened. And the US was obliged to withdraw funding. It still actually participates in meetings, but it's not part of the funding, therefore it doesn't have a vote, and of course it takes a rather dim view of the organization, perhaps consequentially. The UK hasn't taken a step. I was just referring to a newspaper headline which said, as part of the President's spending review in DFID, it might be the case, the headline was, UK to slash funding for UNESCO. In fact, the UK funding bumps along the bottom. It just gives what it's absolutely obliged to give as part of its membership, because it's been pressing for the reform of UNESCO for a long time. It's out of sorts with the organization. But it is not to do with Palestine. No, if it were, I would be even more enraged. But anyway, so that's the background to it. But my concern was really that at the present time, for all its need of reform, and for all that it's not going to be the best deliverer of projects always, although some of its advisory bodies, and I mentioned one, which is the International Conference on, I can't remember, Monuments and Sites or something, ICOMOS, or the Blue Shield, may be good deliverers, but you actually do need a central point in which people are discussing and coordinating and so on. So you need to keep that institution, which is the formal custodian of the convention and all the rest of it, at least capable at the heart to provide that type of coordinating function. At least you need to aspire to that, and this isn't the time to pull the rug out from underneath it. I mean, you may choose to put your project money in different ways. So that's the background to that particular question. And the first question was about... Why is it taking us so long? Well, you have to ask somebody else. I haven't been looking at this that long. But I mean, I think from 1954 to 2003, you probably had people in the military who were saying, well, it's not very practical. Of course, we'll do what we can, but we don't want to have our hands tied. After 2004, I think it became more a question of governments didn't give it priority in parliamentary time. Frankly, they made the first commitment in 2004. I think, as I said earlier on in the lecture, it takes a blow to the system. It was the, all the bombing of the Second World War and Nazi looting and all the rest of it, which actually produced the Hague Convention. It was Dubrovnik, which produced the Second Protocol. It's Palmyra, which got the US to sign up. Not Palmyra, sorry, it was the 2003 that sparked the US signing up. It's Palmyra, actually, which will have brought it to pass in our case, I think, because it was a headline.
Yeah. Well, I have the feeling that it was one of those things that government saw as being worthy but not necessarily a priority. And I think it was argued, I think, in the House in January that we had been observing the spirit of it for quite a long time, and particularly with regard to the choosing of military targets and of deliberately avoiding cultural damage in activities going back to post-2003. And the actual ratification, which does require parliamentary time, does seem to have been the sticking point, because as far as I understand, yes, yes. But in order to get to the point where you have a signature, it does have to go through Parliament. And there just doesn't seem to have been the time given to that for it to actually have taken place. Next question. So, just behind you, Georgina.
Dr. Altaweel, sorry. I appreciate that looting is a very serious issue, but at the end of your talk you seem to suggest a solution wherein a system would be implemented wherein the burden of proof would be on the accused seller of antiquities rather than on the accuser. Given that antiquities by their very nature pass through many hands before being sold, and I would suggest the practical difficulty of registering every legitimate antiquity in the country, how would you suggest implementing such a system?
That's a good question. Yeah, I think the question deals with sort of how do you make something that's difficult to prove its provenance in some cases legitimate. I think I understand that there are a lot of objects where, particularly objects say were inherited from say family collections from generations ago, and granddad basically didn't keep any records. How in the world am I supposed to prove that he didn't steal this or he did steal this or whatever? That's true. I think it is difficult to prove that. But I would suggest certainly objects that are being, say, for instance, sold now, a kind of start date or cutoff date, which has been, actually there are some laws already existing in the books, that there are cutoff dates. We start creating these cutoff dates that when you obtain objects from a specific year, if your store has an object that you have obtained, say, in 2005 or 2007, then from that point on, your store must take only those objects which you can prove its provenance. And thus, I think a kind of licensing authority, potentially, for instance, can issue these kinds of certifications, I think. Some way to check the history of those objects, the way the stories that, whatever information you've gathered to prove how that object was obtained, I think can be done from a certain cutoff date potentially as a starting measure. Perhaps some kinds of objects we can never prove, but I think we need to start some initial sort of starting phase, starting point where we can begin to say, you must now prove something that you've obtained or some object you obtained was legally acquired from a legal place from this date on forward.
Yes. Of course, I find it quite curious because my father served in the Western Desert in the Second World War, and one of the souvenirs he brought back with him was a very little, probably an amulet, which he had bought in the Cairo Museum souvenir shop, and he got a very nice certificate. And the certificate, being written in Arabic when I was a small child, was almost more exotic than the item itself. But, if an RAF sergeant got that from a souvenir shop, you would have thought, this is back in 1943,
yeah, exactly.
that in the meantime somebody could have done something, at least to kind of say, well, where did you get it from? And if it had been grandpa's and in the attic for 50 years, in a way that's almost a legitimate answer, because there's no way you can track back. And I could say, well, my father was in Egypt in 42, 43. I don't know more than that. Yeah. And he's not alive now, so there's no way I can find out. But does that not make me the legitimate owner of something which my father acquired, when we can't actually track back to know what it was? That was a very good question. Next question. Yes, sir.
Hi, I guess just following on from that point, for a question for Mark, the question is, who is actually buying this sort of thing? I mean, you showed the images from eBay and what's being offered, but I'm curious as to who is buying it, and it kind of ties into your last point, which is that at least in a common law jurisdiction like England, if I were a serious collector or buyer of something of significant value, I would want to ensure that I get title in something that I'm buying. And if the seller can't show me that he or she has title, I would be very worried about acquiring that if I wanted to sell it on or keep it in my collection. So with those sorts of, I would say, legal rules, at least that exist in the common law, there is a sort of, I don't know if it would be a market protection, so that people don't acquire things without being insured of title. And whether that can work. I mean, there are certain rules that apply. If something was bought in good faith over 6 years ago, then you have issues with the limitation period which can arise. But in general, who is buying this sort of stuff? Is it low-valued material, in which case maybe they don't care? But I would assume that if it's fairly high-valued, that people would not want to take that risk because of the reasons I just said, that they wouldn't get title or they'd be worried that they wouldn't have clear title.
Yes, Mark.
It's a good question. Just to answer directly in terms of high-value items, the lintel that I was talking about, which was being sold for $50K, there was basically nothing offered in terms of, this is it, here's what you pay for it, and that was that. So I suppose there's some potential buyers who are actually willing to do that. I certainly would not do that. I think it makes sense. If you're going to spend that much money, you could buy several nice cars with that money. You should at least expect some kind of title, some kind of information, but it seems that's not always the case. So there certainly are potentially buyers out there. I think actually a potential worry, though, is those low-level items, because those items are in much greater quantity and much easier to bring in, and they're not going to get too many eyes looking at them. They seem to be low value, so the assumption is often that they shouldn't affect much. But just that simple little example I showed about those figurines, I think you can easily increase those sales and have a substantial impact across time because they're easy to bring in. They don't catch much attention. And those things, certainly most authorities would not be focused on paperwork for those kinds of items. So it's both the high end, but particularly the low end that I'm actually worried about, because they're probably not going to get into legislation that will regulate the low end market. And if you can sell a lot of those things, then you can make a huge impact. And we talked about how these activities that these groups are doing don't require necessarily huge, vast sums of money. So you sell a lot of low end things that certainly will never attract law authorities, can do a lot of damage.
The interesting question there, I was intrigued that ISIS should set up a museum of antiquities trying to adopt a legitimate face. What is the status of one of these certificates if it turns out that what you bought was actually authorized by the ISIS Museum of Antiquities?
Oh.
If you don't read Arabic, which I don't, yeah. I get a certificate which I can't read, and it turns out to say, ISIS Museum of Antiquities. Is this what one would call a genuine mistake?
Well, I suppose that would be a very bad mistake, and again, you should be aware of what you buy, I suppose. So one can say, well, you should at least have it translated before you purchased it.
Yes, that's a very true point. Yes, next question. Yes, madame. Could you just get the microphone, please? Okay.
Thank you. Dr. Kendall, I think you're very brave. How don't you feel vulnerable as a woman travelling in they're very, very male-oriented?
No, I don't. I mean, I feel vulnerable as a person. I think you're fairly vulnerable whether you're male or female. I think I'm less vulnerable, actually, as a female. I don't have to be as brave being a girl, because they're very respectful of women. And also, you're put in this special category because you're not a threat. I don't carry a weapon, and obviously. And because I'm female, I'm not considered to be a threat on any level. But I don't exactly fit into the female category either, so I'm sort of in this third group. And that works very well. And also, we don't have any examples of women being we have examples of women being kidnapped by Al-Qaeda, but not beheaded. So, yeah, thank you for that. Yeah.
Makes us all feel better.
No, they're incredibly respectful. That's right. I mean, I look up to them as well.
Well, we're quite intrigued. How did you actually get the confidence of these people in the first place?
I think it always helps when you speak the language. I mean, to be honest, I don't speak the tribal languages. I speak Arabic, but I don't speak the tribal dialects, or they're not even dialects, they're actual languages. Mahriya, Shahriya, Jabliya, all these different languages. But once you know a little bit about the culture, you can talk about the poetry. I don't work for government. I'm completely independent. Neither for an aid agency nor an embassy, and that's enormously helpful. Because I go in completely unaccompanied. I think if I went in and I had guards, or I tried to pay them, or I showed that I had money, I mean, I basically go in with nothing. I just have a couple of black abayas and that's it. And then wait for whoever shows up at the border to come and get me.
So the linguistic issue is quite interesting, because these poems are actually written in classical, in Quranic Arabic, effectively.
In classical Arabic, yeah.
So this is why everybody has access to them. There's nothing coming out in modern standard, for example.
Well, I mean, some of them are slightly watered down classical,
Yes.
but nothing's... So, of 173 poems in that journal, Sada al-Malahim, 172 of them were in classical Arabic. Only one of them was in local dialect. And, you know, people say, well, can they be understood? Not every bit is understood. You know, people don't understand every word, but somehow the rhythm, the rhyme, the lilt, it carries you on, you get the key words, you get the message. But again, this is why it's so awkward to translate. And I can see why translators tend to avoid it, because you might be very easily able to translate 75% of the lines, but you can't hand that over with your brief. You know, either you do it all or you don't. So they just tend to get missed out.
Yes. We had a question at the front. Hang on. Yes, microphone.
Just a comment. Your knowledge and presentation is absolutely spectacular, Dr. Kendall. And I just think today in the UK it would be important to go on television showing one's appreciation and knowledge of the Muslim culture here in the UK, to show that we understand, appreciate it. Do you know what I mean?
Well, I'm very open to offers, everyone.
Yeah. In terms of sharing it and just, you know...
Actually, I mean, I think you have you make a very serious point in that we don't display our, not so much, let's not say display our knowledge, but display our appreciation of culture and heritage and deep appreciation, and that does resonate. I'm sure Sir Derek will agree that being in an Arab country, being able to communicate in Arabic is an enormous icebreaker. People love the fact that you've bothered.
And I think it would make Muslim people in this country feel less isolated and more appreciated and more part of the culture. You know, if we appreciated and knew more about their culture.
Yes, I think that's right.
It does make a lot of difference, but I can't say that I ever penetrated the poetry to that degree. Certainly not the Jahili poetry.
Yes.
But, yeah.
Well, it is interesting, actually, in possibly no more than the last 10 years, the recognition of the Arabic contribution to mathematics, architecture, the fact that cities like Baghdad and Damascus were far more advanced than most other cities in Europe. As a Hispanist myself, I always put in a plug for the School of Translators in Toledo, of course the Moorish occupation of Spain, where you had Arabs, Jews and Christians working together on the same materials. And a lot of the ancient Greek material actually comes back into Europe through Toledo, because for 200 or 300 years, actually, people do work together. And the nice thing is that the three cultures actually issue their own regulations as to, you know, what do you do about Christmas if you have Islamic friends, and what do you do if you're invited to eat with someone who's not of your faith. And they actually faced up to these issues. This is, 10th, 11th century, to say, well, here we are, guys, what are we actually going to do? And I do rather wish that we followed rather more the example of the School of Translators of Toledo, because they managed it for a very long time, and we're just sort of rediscovering it. The British Museum, of course, has been helping with quite a lot of exhibitions based more on the sort of Middle Eastern material. So I think there is ample scope for this, and I hope that might be a positive conclusion, which I feared we might not reach today, but I think that's a very good one to have reached. Sir, I think you're nodding. Do you have a question? Possibly not. No, sorry, I thought I was picking up on a cue. Do we have any more questions? Sir?
Request really, from Elisabeth. You tell us a lot about the lyricism of the poetry, and I think we got just a couple of lines. Would it be possible to read some more lines in Arabic?
In the Arabic? Do you have a script?
In particular, if you can, it's the one which is "Where are you?" and it carries on like that.
I don't actually have the Arabic of that one with me, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Actually, I can point you to. I've got a link on YouTube where I read some. Well, should I send that to you? Would that be acceptable?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I'm glad you're interested, because I think this is where the power of it lies. It lies in how it sounds.
What you said earlier is that, you know, poetry here is quite a minority type of occupation, but obviously it's not in that Islamic culture or the Arabic culture. Having struggled with Omar Khayyam and tried to make any sense of it, I'm sure it's because the translation is, you know, in English doesn't fully translate. And I'm sure some of the things you were saying, when you read them in English, okay, you can sort of understand it, but I'm sure if you read it in the original Arabic, would, with the lilt, as you say, would come over more, positively.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's a bit like, going back to a 1960s black and white telly when you're reading it in my rather ropey English translations, but it is much more powerful in the original. And
I would be intrigued. I mean, I can see just how powerful and the little bit of AQ activity that you showed, the tribal group and so on, and how convincing that would be to a Yemeni tribal audience. I wonder, you're absolutely right, across the Arab world people are moved by poetry, and poetry idol is very popular. But whether it would have the same appeal, it probably wouldn't be presented in quite the same way in Syria or Iraq, not quite the same way particularly. But that's the first thing. My second observation would be that actually ISIS were tone deaf, and they were completely tone deaf. Even I was instantly turned off by their presentation. I could see it wouldn't convince anybody. The only people it might convince, actually, are precisely here, but not in Westminster or Whitehall or whatever, some lad who aspires to fight. So it's an appeal to foreign fighters, but it's actually a big turn-off, I would have thought, to the average inhabitant of Deir ez-Zor or Raqqa, even as well as the people of government. What do you think?
No, I think that's right. I think that's absolutely spot on. It is. Well, it's a big turn-off amongst the tribes, but and I think you make an interesting point. Okay, so poetry is generally respected, revered, popular indeed throughout the Arab world, but there are degradations of that. I think I've picked a place. I've given you a slightly more zoomed-in view because the Arabian Peninsula, this is where it originally started.
That's why AQ has particular ongoing roots there.
Yes.
And actually, if you look at Syria too, Nusra probably has more popular appeal at a sort of village level than the ISIS lot, who are increasingly dependent on foreign fighters.
I think that's true. I mean, but we do. Islamic State does have its own. I mean, it has its own poetess even, Ahlam Nasr, whose first collection published by a woman in her 20s who was a Syrian resistance fighter originally, called The Flames of Truth. And she churns out these poems in praise of the Islamic State. And there are other poems. There was a poem called Izbah, Massacre, an imperative, you'll appreciate that. Massacre, which came out 3 weeks before the Charlie Hebdo massacres, and did the rounds. So I mean, you can't create the causal link. You can't draw. But there was another one, Call to the Knife, Ned in El Sakina, which came out, just as all the beheadings were happening. So poetry linked to action, definitely, even Islamic State.
Committed poetry, we sometimes call it, I think. Was there a question for the lady in the striped?
Not very serious.
Sorry, you need a microphone. Oh, we've got it. Good. Thank you. Well done.
I just wanted to say I went to a performance of Peter and the Wolf in Baghdad once, and it sounded enchanting, and I thought it sounded so Welsh. And I'm just wondering if some of this would go down well in Wales at the moment. But I was there for
Try to the Eisteddfod, I suppose.
But it did sound, Welsh does sound a little like Arabic. Not that I really know any Welsh at all. It's a sound, it was the lilt, yes.
I certainly think that there are parallels in the sort of, well, I guess in Wales too, a tribal culture to some extent, and the protection of the reverence for the language. And so, certainly there'd be parallels.
But of course, the pride in the language is an interesting one because I think we have to mention Lawrence of Arabia at least once this afternoon. But it's a very interesting point he makes that the Turks despised the local residents because they spoke Arabic, which they saw as an inferior language, and the Arabs saw Arabic being the language of the Quran as superior, Turkish as the language of the occupier, therefore inferior, and the fact that all these British soldiers turned up who'd served in the Sudan and therefore spoke at least a form of Arabic was very impressive. They were so surprised that these men wearing Western uniforms turned up and actually spoke to them in a way that they could understand, and the Turks wouldn't deign to do so, which is an interesting point. And yes, I think Arabic's a very poetic language. So there we are. We shall tell the BBC to put on some Arabic poetry one evening or something like that. It's another conclusion to come out. Madame.
Sorry to do this twice, but just one other comment. Our son now lives in Tehran, married to a beautiful Iranian girl, speaks Farsi. We've just come back, and of course, what struck us, or what we now know, is that in Iran, like across the Arabic world, poetry is commonplace. Every child, knows what it is to learn poetry from an early age. It's part of their culture. I've now just had this light bulb moment. Why don't we get their heads, the Persian, Iranian culture, the Arabic world, to actually agree on something? And that's something being poetry, because they both revere it, and they both have their long history of it.
Well, poetry, I mean, it's a lovely idea. But of course, poetry has always been used as a tool of war. And the actual, poetry itself can be a war. You get these jousting competitions.
Yes.
Still today in
Yes.
Yemen, you get teams. I've been in the middle of one. Teams of poets on either side.
Teams of poets, yeah.
Who it's also a stamina. How long can you keep it going? The recitation, and then the next team comes in. It's a bit like Eminem. I don't know if anyone's seen the film 8 Mile. They're probably not. Okay, so yeah, so it's a bit like that sort of rap competition, but in a more upmarket perhaps way.
Can you imagine being bashed over the head with a sonnet? Of course, there are parallels, because, of course, a lot of the verse which we use, we don't see as poetry, we see as songs. So you could read everyone knows the lyrics of the Beatles songs, which you could read as poetry. But we don't call it poems because they're pop songs.
Yeah, I must confess, I was sitting in a friend's wedding a couple of weekends ago, and they had all the usual hymns. I hadn't been to a church for a while, so actually then reading the hymns on the hymn sheet, I was thinking, this is fascinating. This is just like my jihadist poetry. Soldiers of the cross and going to war for Christendom and Jerusalem, and it was really. I was reading it in a completely different light from when you're just singing it in church.
Yes, by Jove, hymns ancient and modern as a weapon of war. We'll have to have a lecture on that subject, I'm sure. I know a friendly bishop who might talk about it. I'm afraid the Gresham laws of time are such that we really do have to draw to a conclusion. As I said at the beginning, I wasn't too sure whether we'd actually come to any firm, reasonable, positive conclusions, but we have at last heard, if you haven't seen it in the papers, that at long last Britain is ratifying the Hague Convention. Blue Shield is worth looking at online, because this is a practical way in which help can be offered. There are some useful organisations like EAMENA, the Endangered Archaeology in the Middle East and North Africa project, which people might actually know about. The British government is putting money up to train people to work on conservation. So there are positive elements to be seen here. And of course, you've now been inspired to go out and study ancient Arabic poetry. So I think at the very least, we have a positive point to make today. But firstly, I would like to thank our speakers very much indeed, because this is a contentious topic. It's a very, very wide open one. I think we've all come across angles today that we hadn't necessarily anticipated, expected, or known about. And I think that's always a useful part of a Gresham event. You go away having learnt something you didn't know before. I think it's also been very useful actually to be able to draw your particular specialisations out, because this does go out on social media. We have over 7 million hits a year. And we did notice, slightly to our shame, we haven't actually covered the Middle East very much in recent years in our lecture programme, which is something we shall possibly try to alleviate. And, of course, I do have to express our thanks, as ever, to our sponsors, the Corporation of the City of London, the Mercers Company, and, as ever, the Gresham College staff, as represented at the back by Georgina. And, of course, thanks for yourselves. Now, you do have an unexpected prize. You've actually stuck out the whole afternoon. May I invite you to have a drink next door in the headmaster's study. Thank you very much indeed, in the meantime, to our speakers. Thank you.